architect and urban planner, and a member of Participatory Lab. I would like to welcome you to the first today plenary of the third day of the conference. After the first 2 days that we have focused on issue of participation related to administration and private practice, we now try to frame administration in 3 different views. Our panelists come from academia, and we are going to talk about participation with a more critical perspective and trying to add it in a wider context of institutional change and urban transformations. Our panelists will share their views on these issues through cases from Greece, France, Spain, and Germany. So without further delay, I would like to introduce you our panelists, our speakers. We have Agnès Deboulet, a professor from University Paris VIII and Curie Director of CEDES Cairo. She will share her thoughts about participation in France. We have with us Athanasiou, a professor in the Department of Architecture of University of Thessaloniki. She will focus in the case of Greece. And via Zoom, we have Kalandides, a professor of place management at Manchester Metropolitan University and director of the Institute of Place Management, who will share his experience from Berlin, and Marc Pradel from the Department of Sociology in the University of Barcelona, that will focus on the case of Barcelona. So we start with Agnès.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to Common Space. I'm very happy to be here, and I will try to be quite short, but I'm not sure it will be easy. So I've been asked to describe a little bit participatory tools, not so much in design, in fact, but participatory tools used in urban planning, mostly in France. And I will slowly go from institutional dimension and frameworks to more to participation initiated by civil society. So there is a great diversity of participatory tools in France that are mostly institutionalized since at least 20 years. And their main goal is to reinforce democracy and enhance social ties. And also, of course, to avoid and minimize conflicts. So a list, non-exhaustive, of these compulsory tools that exist since 200 centuries for the first one, which is public inquiry in case of expropriation since the 19th century. There is also La Commission Nationale de Débat Public, which is a large institution that exists and is solicited in case of very large-scale projects. They are engaging public debates with experts and citizens during consultations that takes around 1 year. The third one is compulsory consultations in case of environmental risk or damage, and projects like, and also when you have new master plans or major changes in existing master plans. And then we have another set of participatory tools that are connected to, associated to démocratie de proximité, proximity democracy, meaning the obligation to have neighborhood councils in cities that have more than 30,000 inhabitants. And more recently, we have a new set of tools like public hearings, especially in the case of climate with the Convention citoyenne pour le climat. Following this rise in institutional tools for participation since 25 years, let's say, we have also a rise and increase of professionals of participation, with a constellation of participation professionals that have been well described by Alif Mazou and Magali Nonjon, since participation is compulsory in many occasions of public bids, for example, in many occasions. So there is professionals of participation within municipalities. Nearly almost all large municipalities have their own service of democracy and participation, as consultants, coming from political science, geography, sociology, etc., as designers, but also as intermediaries between social landlords and dwellers. For example, don't forget that in France we have 25% of the housing stock that is public housing. And there is, of course, and we often tend to, there is a large network of researchers on participation in France, mostly focused on institutional democracy and institutional participation and democracy. But contrasting with that, there is also a large, very little attention, let's say, that is given to ordinary and citizen-based participation, which is, of course, much more active than institutionalized one. So let's say that we have a lasting tradition of political contest, and this participation from the bottom comes from that. And since 10 years, a more radical expression, since we have les zones à défendre, les ZAD, namely in the case of the airport, contesting the airport of Notre-Dame-des-Landes near Nantes, but also at least 10 big ZAD in France now, which are lasting occupations of space to contest large-scale projects, large-scale development projects. You have been having les indignes, or like indignados in Spain, and also occupation of public space through the movement of Nuit debout, Place de la République. And also recently, of course, you have been hearing of the new expression of participation and engagement in the deserted space of urbanity, which are the new peripheries, and people rising against environmental inequalities, let's say, which are called the yellow jackets, mostly. But you have also another tradition that is one of the Ateliers Populaires d'Urbanisme, popular planning workshops that started in the 70s and that are still continuing, in fact. Self-organization in COPs and co-housing, also, which is quite old. And since 2010, as well as other European and emerging countries, let's say mostly, a crisis of democracy, of representative democracy, has led to a rise of community organizing and a new set of alliance between professionals, academics, and social movements, or neighborhood committees, any kind of movements, in connection with major, let's say, for instance, tenants associations. So there is namely this Alliance Citoyenne, inspired by community organizing, the movement of Saul Alinsky in the United States, Appui, which is very present today, and in this conference. But then we have several shortcomings of institutional participation that led to major critiques of this participation. The first critiques is around conflict avoidance. Institutional participation tends to avoid conflict and leading to a major depoliticization of topics, which has been studied by Eliasov in the States, but also by Marion Carrel, for instance, in France. The second aspect is that participation is mostly reduced to consultation, and it's not anymore deliberative. Or we know that participation is about deliberation, meaning the capacity to have and to get new opinions through debate and exchange, which is very often not the case because of inequality of positions. The third thing is that topics and objectives of consultation is often very far from people's needs and concerns. Let's say, when you speak about urban planning in popular neighborhoods, very often people feel not concerned. It's not their first concern. Their first concern, especially with the COVID and with the economic crisis, is inequalities, having access to job, to health, many other things than urban planning. If you want to, unless people are really concerned by planning issue, you cannot expect them to be involved in debates in urban planning if they are not concerned. This is a major illusion of planners. I'm among the planners, so I can say it more easily as well, even if I'm also sociologist. But okay, then participation as a direct engagement of people is taking mostly place out of the institutional space of participation is not taken into consideration. There have been an exception with a very recent report written by our friend Romain Leclerc here on the resources of popular neighborhoods. It was the first time of 20 years of active, very active policy in two popular neighborhoods called Politique de la Ville that consider that, yes, these people, after all, they are not waiting for us, experts and professionals, to have their own resources, social resources. It was a discovery, you know. Then community-led organizing is not well considered, and communities are very suspicious in France because there is this big idea of republic, united and stuff. So what about migrants communities? It's very, very, very suspected. And then it leads to major disempowerment of popular neighborhoods, especially in urban renewal projects. So I come to this last point, nearly the last point. As we know, deliberation is central in participation. Thus, how can it be achieved in unequal distribution of powers between technicians and ordinary dwellers? This is our major question. What is the position of professionals? Most of the time, there are also direct stakeholders in favor of speeding mobility and imposed changes in housing and as well as living conditions. For instance, in France, there is a major market of participation that arises with urban renewal projects. 400 urban renewal project, it means a lot of money for planners and for participation specialists. So most of the time, these participation professionals, they are considered by the people as on the side of municipalities, so as enemies, not as co-producers. It leads to several key questions. Many others, but I will address this. The first thing is translation. We are in a country that is very cosmopolitan now, especially in large cities. But translation is never addressed. What about language in cosmopolitan setting when most of the people in these popular neighborhoods don't speak French? I mean, are not able really to, need translation, at least the first generation. What about expert language versus citizens' knowledge, which is never considered when experts, professionals tend to always use this very technical language that is not understood. There is a high level of complexity of urban processes, master scheme, urban renewal. It's very, very complex. And so how do we expect people to cope with that without proper tools to help them enter into the thing? Then there is a growing distrust. Then, and naturally, I will say, there is a growing distrust from the people towards the state agents, going along with higher segregation and a feeling of disempowerment. I have very old now photos that I wanted to show because this is the first fight that gave rise to Appui, namely, and others movements in the 2014, no, not 14, it was in the first, no, 2006 or 7, I'm sorry. And you have this urban renewal project of social housing. So it leading to destroy social housing, to rebuild them somewhere else, or to have mixed neighborhoods, in fact. And you see this flyer saying that we should rehabilitate rather than erase, and stop with the despite. Arrêter le mépris. Stop to despise the people, which is a very strong word to describe what people feel. It's not even no democracy. It's a real, gap between understandings of experts, politicians, and what people need. So to end it with that, there is a rise of large-scale conflicts due to democratic cracks and verticality of powers, especially in large-scale development projects. So I have been quoting Notre-Dame-des-Landes, airport contested, with a complete self-organization in camps and so on, a lasting thing that gives a lot of ideas to many people of how resistance is able to be to success in the end. And then there is a large network of professionals, architects, social workers, that worked in slums together with slum dwellers like Meryl Sineus has been showing yesterday in Calais, mostly, with migrants, but also in Ile-de-France region. And it builds a strong capacity among architects and professionals, a counter capacity, I mean, another kind of skills. There is also a third thing is that there is also a broadened critique of growth and large connection with small-scale social economy projects and solidarity initiatives that is rising. And what I will call, following Holston, which is we worked on Brazil, an insurgent citizenship in most of the vulnerable communities or peripheral groups with immigrants. Which states the failure of participation also to the elections and at large. So now we have that more than 40 urban renewal projects that are contested and supported by Appui or the association Right to Housing and so on. And it leads to what we can call agonistic conflicts or agonistic participation rather than conflicts, sorry, because agonistic. And so the major question to conclude is what does it mean when you contest urban renewal project, but you also layered large-scale urban development project or development project as exploitative projects. So there is a very important need to support local residents or local, affected people, whatever their legal forms, to have a real access to information, to become equal partners during the consultation process, and to reinforce their technical capacity to express other views and propose alternative projects. There is also a necessity to act and to perform as real intermediate third actors within a community-led negotiation process. I insist that the process should be community-led, not the opposite. Depending on the local authorities and the complex set of actors and technicians in place with the National Authority of Urban Renewal, these facilitators take the form of an insurgent or protagonist planning or co-created process that we have to recognize and to acknowledge as a new force alongside with the communities. So I think it's, I thought from the beginning that this was the last slide, but this is the last one. And to end with, I will say that it's important to create opportunities to challenge urban projects rather than building cosmetic interventions, and promote a real independent intermediation or third party with the capacity to be funded. This is a major campaign that we have with Appui since a few years. We need to allocate funds, specific funds to communities to hire their own experts, because the inequality of powers with local authorities and technicians and national agencies is too big. And they can't, you can't escape this capacity building from to reinforce them. There is also a new set of democratic agency that we can use, like the référendum citoyen. We use this citizen referendum in one of the urban renewal projects in Saint-Denis. Actually, it was quite successful, expressing the need not to have this kind of dwelling to be building to be demolished. And this goes along with a reflection on what is a facilitator, what is the position of the facilitator, how can you allow him or her to be, or the group to be independent and use this budget with popular groups and along them with them. Finally, there is also, of course, a central place of the university to be played in this game. And going also encouraged by new fundings for research that is a paradox. This is a paradox, but there is a new interest for co-produced research along with communities, and we are involved with Appui and the university, for instance, in a large national research agency project called Poulios between France and Brazil on co-production of space and of the city. and it's really focused on also on the hindrances and difficulties to cope, but also on the necessity to rethink cooperation, the modes of cooperation between the actors. I hope I have not been too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnès. I think that you gave us a very holistic portrait of participation process in France and all the issues that arise around them. Now we move to Evie, and she will present the case of Greece. Do you need the laptop or okay? Should we?
Agnès, can I push this? Thank you. Okay, I'll try looking there.
You can also have this one.
Thanks.
For more convenience.
Hello, I'm really glad to be here. I want to congratulate the organizers, Common Space and Participatory Lab, and thank you very much for the invitation, Dimitris, and the rest in the Common Space. So I'm going to shift focus from institutions to foundations. It's here. So in the often quoted article of Sherry Arnstein in 1969, she suggested that it is the redistribution of power that enables the have-not citizens presently excluded from the political processes to. So this hasn't moved. Okay, so this no, also okay. No, yeah, you're right. Okay. So it is the redistribution of power that enables the have-not citizens presently excluded from the political processes to be deliberately included in the future. It is the strategy by which the have-nots join in determining how information is shared, goals and policies are set. And she adds, participation without redistribution of power is an empty and frustrating process. It allows the power holders to claim that all sides have been considered, but makes it possible for only some of those sides to benefit. So otherwise, if there is no redistribution of power, participation only reproduces existing power structures and becomes a process of legitimation of the choices of those holding power. So, as we all know, during the last decades, participation has become a mainstream concept. We can see it appearing in the new urban agenda of the UN, participatory cities that promote civic engagement and gender a sense of belonging and ownership among their inhabitants. It has been introduced in many institutional frameworks in many countries. So, as it has become part of the new regimes of urban politics, there is a need to problematize the concept and look critically at how it is incorporated in urban politics and what it represents, because it does have different conceptualizations and a variegated content and role in urban politics. So we should ask questions like, who initiates participation, who participates, how is participation performed and through what kind of processes, and most importantly, I think, towards what end. So I'm going to focus on Greece during the economic crisis and to the shift that I call from state planning to benevolent urbanism. So during the crisis in Greece, we have the planning reform that actually was an obligation instigated by the Troika. It was listed among the measures to improve the business climate, and actually it aimed at making land more flexible to urban development. So I think many here have already talked about special urban plans and how they do not incorporate participation at all. So we had a transitional stage in urban planning, but we also have had a shrinkage in public expenditure. And at the same time, the corporate sector, the private investments, they also shrank. The construction industry came to a standstill. So the big business in general became, although there was legislation to encourage investment and to improve the business climate, big business remained reluctant. So in this limbo state, both of the planning framework and of development, we had new agents appearing in the urban development processes. So the first one is the corporate sector, who actually acquired a new role as the guarantors of the safe and vivid function of public space, often taking over maintenance, security, programming, and refashioning of public space. Companies like Lidl and Cosmote, and more recently in Athens, many more, have been involved in this. Also, we had a surge in citizen-led initiatives claiming public use of publicly owned properties, appropriating public space, or creating new public spaces. And of course, what I'm going to focus in, philanthropic institutions, foundations acquired a new role and extended their funding priorities and their funding activities from cultural, social, and education projects to projects of urban development. So philanthropic foundations, as we all know, have very moral and very ambitious missions. Like, for example, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation wants to have a positive impact to society at large, and Onassis also has a very moral and impressive mission to create the conditions and explore the ideas and trigger bold discussions that shape and shake society. And also they're very generous. They have a lot of money to spend. So they're always very welcome by national governments. But at the same time, philanthropic foundations exercise power through the granting processes. In many countries, of course, they operate in very favorable tax environments, which actually helps the respective founders of the foundations to protect their assets from taxes. And at the same time, they function in parallel to democratically instituted and accountable processes of the state. So in Greece, the most prominent such cases of what I call benevolent urbanism are all very well known, is the competition for the regeneration of central Athens, centered around the pedestrianization of Panepistimiou Street, that aimed at offering Athens a competitive edge against all other European and international metropolises. That was not implemented. And of course, the most prominent such case is the Stavros Niarchos Cultural Foundation, Cultural Center, which actually is a project that resembles in many things, in many aspects, urban development projects of the 90s and 2000s in Europe and the US. In terms of the promoted model of urban governance, its iconic architectural design created by a star architect, but most important in its lax relationship to planning institutions and planning regulations. So recently, we had an upscaling of the action of philanthropic foundation. They shifted, in this case that I'm going to talk about, from specific projects to strategies that have a metropolitan, they address the metropolises, they have a metropolitan scale. So we have this shift from a project to strategies. So I'm going to talk about the 100 Resilient Cities initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller, of course, is a much bigger foundation than Onassis and Stavros Niarchos. It ranks 26th in the philanthropic foundations of the world in terms of its endowment, size of endowment, and assets. It also has a very impressive and moral mission. So the Rockefeller Foundation is one of the big philanthropy, and its benevolent mission, as stated in its website, is unchanged since 1913, and it is to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. Today, the foundation advances new frontiers of science, this is a quote, data, policy, and innovation to solve global challenges related to health, food, power, and economic mobility. It has developed international activities since its first years of its foundation. And along the Carnegie Foundation and Ford Foundation in the US, they are mentioned as the big three. And they have focused on increasing American foreign influence, and thus they have played a key role in establishing American global power. Parmar suggests that big three philanthropic foundations sought to create an integrated global elite from the 1950s and the 1970s who could serve as conduits for American interests within the institutions of its nation. So in 2013, they launched the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. According to the website, the main concern that triggered the initiative is the crisis that many cities around the world face today due to the combined effects of climate change, globalization, and urbanization. So along this, this was the mission, let's say, of the initiative. It has established also collaboration with a platform of over 100 partners who were NGOs, universities, public utility companies, and the corporate sector. Big companies like Microsoft and Siemens collaborated, and they were eager to offer the technical expertise and advice in issues like governance, management, communication, and procurement. So the foundation offers $1 million US dollars to each of the participating cities, but it's not very clear whether this funding is directly granted to the participating cities or whether it is received through paid services to the platform partners. So the initiative has played a key role in disseminating the concept of resilience and in infusing it in the operational plans and the institutional structure of local authorities in cities around the world, cities as different as Pittsburgh, Ramallah, Surat, and Thessaloniki. Nevertheless, resilience, as we know, remains a blurry concept that can mean different things to different people. The foundation also has created a common framework that sets the basic principles and the directives of its strategy. So it's the City Resilience Framework that was actually designed by Arup, of course, one of the biggest engineering consultancies in the world. So the CRF, of course, understands vulnerability to environmental and social risks as an intrinsic attribute of contemporary cities, north and south, and not as a geographically and socially variegated issue, constantly produced by socio-natural processes. Depoliticizing urban processes and sidelining difference, cities employ the same concepts and the same graphics provided by the CRF, this common framework. So the initiative employs a post-political, strictly techno-managerial approach to urban socio-environmental problems and remains blind to all the actors and processes that produce and reproduce the risks and shocks identified by each city. So participation is a very central thing in all strategies of all 100 cities. And it says that many seats around the table should be ensured to create a sense of shared ownership or a joint vision to build city resilience. So both Athens and Thessaloniki have created their own strategies. Of course, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I'm going just to highlight who were the partners who actually were mentioned in the strategies to promote the goal of participation. So Athens, one of the Athens pillars set by the strategy was to make Athens an open city, and to promote this goal, the strategy declared that the city should develop synergies with the city stakeholders, and enhance participation. So towards this end, the partner that will materialize this end were, among others, like local authorities, Greek service providers, the National Center of Social Research, and public utility companies, is CityMart. So CityMart is an international consultancy with a mission to empower city officials to better serve the communities through access to data, insights, and peers. It has already sold its methods and tools to over 130 cities. Another partner is a Transatlantic Policy Lab, who is created by Bertelsmann's Foundation. So in effect, is a consultancy backed by the Washington branch of the German Bertelsmann Foundation, which is one of the world's biggest mass media companies. The Athens strategy also sets the goal to make the city more transparent and more accountable. And towards this end, it makes a partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies and Bloomberg Associates, both founded by Michael Bloomberg, who is an American businessman in global financial services, mass media, and software, as well as mayor of New York for 3 consecutive terms from 2002 to 2013. Bloomberg Philanthropies promote a data-driven approach to global change, and Bloomberg Associates acts as a consultancy to advise and help city governments to successfully tackle complex and difficult challenges to positively impact the quality of life of their citizens. And finally, in Athens, there was this workshop that created the guidelines for to enliven the public space in Athens. So it suggested the tactics, as it said, to activate public space through engaging and empowering citizens in order to promote, and I quote, clean, green, and safe public spaces. The report employed the broken windows theory and proposed citizens' participation in public space maintenance through adoption agreements with the municipality. So Thessaloniki is in the same line. It also foregrounds participation. It boasts that it itself was a product of participation of 2,000 citizens and over 40 local institutions. Co-production of public spaces introduced. There was a pilot project to co-produce Minas Patrikiou Parkokritis, a park in the eastern part of the city. And to facilitate this, there was a partnership from the platform of the Rockefeller Foundation partners, the Street Plans Cooperative, which is based in Miami and New York, and is the firm, the cooperative that actually has popularized the term tactical urbanism. As we know, tactical urbanism covers a variety of temporary, low-budget and participatory small-scale interventions that are often suggested as an alternative to neoliberal urban policies, although many would argue that it represents small-scale experiments that actually cover the ground left vacant by shrunk public services and often legitimizes its hegemonic policies through citizen participation. So, I'm going to try to conclude. Yeah, well, these are some photos from this pilot project that was implemented in Parkokritis in Thessaloniki. And finally, another final project is the project to regenerate the urban waterfront of Thessaloniki. That was actually a scheme produced by Deloitte, which obviously is a huge global power in consultancy services, and it was paid by the World Bank in as part of the partners of Rockefeller Foundation. So, what is the problem with all this? I mean, is that actually it promotes it materializes specific kind of urban governance, which introduce a new many new global agents into urban development processes, and actually it represents, it acts as a catalyst for processes of neoliberalization, as it transfers hegemonic discourses from the global discussion to local environments. So just to mention these that were mentioned in the strategies, these hegemonic discourses: competitive city, resilience and green development, innovation and global networking, theory of broken windows, clean and safe public space, and a depoliticized public space for consumption and leisure. And this corresponds to urban policies that are suggested through the strategies: public-private partnerships, surveillance by active citizens, business improvement districts, co-creation of public spaces, place-making and tactical urbanism, and of course participation as a technique-based enterprise orchestrated by global experts, as the street plan cooperative. So just to conclude, participation within this initiative becomes a matter of techno-managerial know-how, designed and delivered by global experts and incorporated in diversified urban context as a depoliticized dimension of the global goal of urban resilience. Commonly perceived within planning as a democratizing and potentially transformative process, citizen participation is thus co-opted by hegemonic politics as constituted in a multiscalar way and reduced to a technique. Thus, it loses its potential to function as a self-instituted agonistic process, unsettling unjust socio-environmental processes and acting towards justice and democracy. So, just a few points to conclude. The Foundation acts as a catalyst for the transition to new processes of urban governance. This is the last one, you can relax. And production of urban space. The Foundation also links, which is very important this was my basic point actually, it acts as a link towards development, local development, between local development processes and global partners with agents of urban development. The Foundation employs participation as a technique-based enterprise orchestrated by global experts. It lasts as long as funding is secured. It offers legitimation to urban policies that are parallel to local institutions and are not binding in any way. And the Foundation also acts as a conduit, as I said earlier, to global hegemonic discourses. So that was my point. I will be happy to answer questions and to participate in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evie. So we move, I'm sure that we'll move to the questions later. So we move to our third presenter. Aris is with us.
I'm here with you.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so I will avoid sharing a presentation since I'm away anyway, and this makes our whole conversation much harder. But I will just show a couple of slides when I think it is necessary, and I will try to stick to 10 to 15 minutes and see if we need more time afterwards. So what I'm going to do is the following. I will talk about Berlin, and I will explain a couple of things about how participation works in Berlin and what that may mean for us, what we can learn from it, etc. Right? So that's where I'm going with this. And just to give you an idea of what my content is going to be about, just sharing one slide. I will talk a bit about the political context, and I insist that it's both a political and an institutional context. And I will give you very shortly 3 case studies and come to considerations afterwards. So it's important to understand the German context, which means that Berlin itself is a state, right? Berlin, it's not just a city, it's a state that has a certain autonomy, it has its own laws in certain ways, and there are 12 municipalities in Berlin that each then have their own administration and institution too. So this is our point of departure. In 2016, we had elections in Berlin. We just had them in September, and a coalition came to power. A coalition between three parties: the left, the Greens, and the Social Democrats. The political context is important. That's why I'm insisting on it. And the three partners agreed upon a program, right? A kind of a contract of what they're going to do. And there is a large part of this program that has to do with participation. So this contract, let's call it the coalition contract, has stated several principles, such as social justice for everybody, diversity, the importance of employment, the importance of education and housing as principles for participation. And after that, some more, focusing more into participation after that, a whole section on how to do it, creating a new online platform. So creating a whole institutional framework around how to do participation. It's important to state that this is not the first time that this happens, that this has happened in the past, and participation has been part of Berlin policy for a very long time. So what we are now is that the government of Berlin created a citizen assembly, the way that citizen assemblies have worked in other countries, Assemblée Citoyenne in France, we've got that example. And it's a citizen assembly that came up with the exact framework and the guidelines for participation. So there is a first, let's say, step by the government. Then there is a citizen committee, which is chosen in a particular way by sortition, right, like kind of a lottery. And then they design the participatory framework and the exact guidelines. So from there, we have these guidelines today, and the state also says that we have each municipality in Berlin has then its own guidelines and works on it on its own. So from that point, a lot of things happened in Berlin, and many projects changed. I would like to focus on a first one and give you an example, which is the Haus der Statistik, and I will share it with you so you get an idea what we're talking about. So I'm sharing again. Sorry, takes some time. There you go. So Haus der Statistik is what you see here. It's a building that was erected in the 1970s in East Germany, as that time the building of the statistics in East Germany. This is a building that was then that remained empty for a very long time. And what you see here is furthermore some images in 2015. The building was squatted. And the squatters were actually an artist initiative that at a point where a lot of migrants were coming to Berlin, decided that they were coming into the city and they were building for themselves. The building, a whole process started from there. The government started cooperating with the former squatters with the initiative. They came up with a process on how to design and how to co-create this building. And finally, what we have today is a use where partly the government and the local government in particular will be using, partly the initiatives themselves that wanted space for social housing, space for other projects, etc. So we've come to a project, let's say, where an activist group, and that's extremely important, an activist group has occupied a space and has demanded participation, and the government simply added to it. The second example is at a much larger scale, and that's why I'm not talking about participation in participatory design, but I'm talking, just as Agnès did earlier, about participatory planning and participatory governance, which I think is a point here. What is the problem? The problem is that tourism in Berlin is exploding. And these are some figures just before the pandemic started, showing you just numbers, right? From 100% in 1992, we've come to 400% up by 2018. This creating a tension in the city, creating a tension among tourists and locals. And there was also a very strong movement that demanded that the state does something to stop that. The state came up with a strategy, a kind of a long-term framework on tourism and how to deal with it in the long term. And one of the things that the framework, which by the way was designed by geographers at the Humboldt University, the framework suggested that a kind of a citizen committee was put together as a permanent consulting body with the tourism office, and that tourism moves from tourism marketing to tourism management, and that citizens play a very important role in that. So here again, we have a kind of a citizen pressure from below that leads to an institutional change. The committee was designed, and actually it was my team who designed it, but the pandemic came, so it was not actually implemented, and we're waiting to see what is going to happen in the future. Also, now that the government has changed, even though the coalition remains the same, so we think that they will keep the guidelines. It has a lot of other problems with it, right? So Airbnb, so short-term rentals is part of that. It's a way that that rental is not affordable in Berlin any longer, and citizens need to have a say in all of that. The third case is again at an institutional level, but it's one of the boroughs of Berlin. Spandau is in the periphery of the city. And as I said, you have the guidelines for Berlin, and then you have guidelines for each different borough. Not all boroughs have the guidelines, by the way. What is the concept? And I don't need the presentation any longer. What is the concept? The concept is that place matters. And place matters means that not only Berlin is different than Athens, but one borough in Berlin has a different history and different tradition than another one. So each borough should go into its own decisions of how it wants to proceed for it, etc. In the case of Spandau, one of the major issues is how we define the citizen in citizen participation. Is a German citizen a citizen? Is anybody who lives in Spandau a citizen? Or is anybody with stakes a Spandau a citizen, which would also include, let's say, absentee landlords? And we decided in the process, together with the administration and the people, that we would mean anybody who has a permanent address in Spandau, independent of their state citizenship. But that would not include people with stakes that live otherwhere. This would be the case of institutional landowners. The other problem that we had was how do we define the accessibility of information, transparency, and all of that stuff? And we said we have certain principles through thresholds, inclusion, early involvement, and the whole idea is that there will be a list of projects that is created while we speak. Part of it will be online in the platform that the state of Berlin has created called mine.berlin.de. And citizens will be able to find out exactly what is happening and participate in the project. So the accessibility of information is extremely important. And then there were some other issues. A new coordinating officer position was for citizen participation was created in the town hall, and a whole evaluation framework, etc. So these are the three projects. As you see, they're quite different because they're at different levels and they involve very different things. One was very much about the design and the reuse of their building. The other was about a sectoral economic process such as tourism, and the third one is more geographical, about a particular area and the framework. some considerations before I finish. First of all, it is important to understand that participation with its tradition in Berlin is not just deliberation. And this is something that Agnès mentioned several times, and I cannot stress it enough. Deliberation is one way of doing it, right? It's a consensual way of doing it. We sit together, we discuss. It's a very Habermasian way of understanding it. There is, however, something that has a very long tradition in Berlin, which is the agonistic type of participation, as Chantal Mouffe would probably call it, and that is the activist. That's the part that pressures the government, that occupies the building, that stages protests of different ways. And these two coincide, and it's almost impossible to completely take them apart. So the fact that we have a framework on citizen participation has to do very much with the fact that there is pressure from movements, and these movements have actually created it. Then we could consider two things that I think are important: the importance of place and space in the whole thing. And that is an issue because we need to think about how we can transfer experiences that we have in participation, let's say, from one place to another, right? We're talking about, earlier we talked about Greece, and talked about France, and I'm talking about Berlin now. There is a very different place history of participation. There's a different history of institutions, of practices, of players, representations, they are different. And then there are interconnections. So the fact that Berlin has a very strong participatory movement has a lot to do with the fact that there is a connection with the Barcelona movement, right? So these things are interconnected. Places are not isolated in that. There are ideas that come back and forward. And finally, the spaces of participation themselves. So the Haus-der Statistik that I was showing you, the Haus-der Statistik themselves can offer a field to formulate and claim citizenship rights. So the fact that a group gets together, claims the building, they're not just claiming a building, they're claiming rights, they're claiming citizenship rights of participation. And finally, we need to think of all these roles together, right? The role of activism, the role of experts in all that, organizations, NGOs. So Evie talked a lot about these institutions, commercial actors, of course, the role of government and administration, and extremely important, the role of intermediaries, right? Which is something that we keep saying, people who can translate between different groups, that can sit down and mediate between conflict. Mediating between conflict doesn't mean that you reject conflict, right? It's just that you see conflict as a productive element of the participatory process. And finally, I would like to propose one thing. We need to repoliticize participation. There's a panelist yesterday said, oh, let's not politicize participation. I don't know how you cannot politicize something which is deeply political. The institutional framework in Berlin was not a natural phenomenon. It was created through particular political powers, through activism, through parties, political parties. The way that activism works in Berlin, it has its own basis in political actions. I'm not talking about parties necessarily. Even the way we understand the citizen, the way we understand civil society, right, is important. So is it something very, are we thinking of something only benevolent? Or are we thinking of civil society as having internal conflicts and internal fault lines too? And finally, even terms such as accountability and transparency. I'm all for accountability and transparency, but how these are defined is also clearly political. So let's repoliticize the discussion. Don't make it just a technocratic discussion. And I think that will lead us much, much further. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Aris, for your insights and your presentation. I think it will it was food for thought for the discussion that we're going to have later. So we move to our final presentation. Marc, are you there with us?
Yes, here I am. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Aris, Avi, and Agnès for their interesting presentations. I think it's easier to present the last one. I want to speak about Barcelona and participation, but focusing a lot on the role of citizens. So I will share my presentation. Wait a second, which is this one. Yeah, okay. I can put that. Here it is. So I would like to present a bit the context of Barcelona, just to understand how new wave of participatory mechanisms appear. And the idea of the presentation is to show not that much the institutional mechanism, the top-down approaches to participation in urban regeneration and other I lost the word. Other policy fields, this is what I wanted to say, but focusing on how citizens have transformed this participation in a way which, as was pointing out, the idea of repoliticizing participation. And the issue here is that Barcelona, with the recovery of democracy, had this, has fostered participation and involvement of civil society. This was a moment of coming back of democracy and the strong role of neighborhood associations in deciding how the city should be. So the city council could not avoid involving citizens in participation, and it was a very political participation in the sense that real things were being decided. And this weekend, with the organization of large renewal of the city with the Olympic Games in 1986, so it was not that long, because then started the idea that large-scale projects could not be tackled with this form of participation. So participation remained, but it was a bit, it lost the political content, and there was the administrative process, or the consultory process of decisions which were already taken, or which could be modified but could not be discussed. This was the evolution of this. Then the rise of poverty and inequalities and the visualization of corruption and lack of transparency brought some weakening of the thought of that the model was broken. The idea that citizens could decide about the city was broken. So this brought new political movements and initiatives. And sorry, I have to. Here. So there was this has been widely studied, how there was a social mobilization claiming for a new citizenship agenda, and the Indignados movement is quite popular, but this had a very strong local scale as well. So we know the Indignados movement at the national level and Podemos and so on, but then there was a strong local agenda of this Indignados movement, and there was the idea that we have to transform local politics and how we think about the city. And the idea was of the whole movement to strengthen political and even civil, because there was this change in laws in which the free speech and the demonstration rights were being curtailed. So there was the idea of strengthening political and civil rights, and strengthening social rights, claims for social justice. And the strengthening political rights meant more participation and involvement of citizens, which was translated into like two dimensions. The one is, and the most known one perhaps, is the creation of new political coalitions, of citizens' initiatives, and the creation of new political parties, which included the traditional leftist parties, but it were quite new. And in the case of Barcelona, the rise into power of Barcelona en Comú and Ada Colau, the former leader of the anti-eviction platform. This is known story, but there was the other story, which were the prefigurative practices which were emerging at the very local level, at neighborhood level, which were claiming for involving directly citizens in the management of services and facilities. And the interesting thing is how these two elements were somehow interacting, generating new, to some extent, that this is a matter of discussion and of research, but now a new governance model, or a more open governance model. So these new initiatives are very wide, so that we have lots of things here, and I put 3 examples: new social centers, self-managed social centers, neighborhood plans for employment, which were like the neighborhood organizing to generate employment through, for instance, solidarity economy, and solidarity networks for food distribution, mutual help, etc., which were like the more salient cases, but we could find other things. And then some examples of new public spaces managed by neighbors. You have here Space Germanetas, which is like one of these squares in Eixample, which was recovered by neighbors, and then they put their community gardens. They generated a meeting place and somehow an open air social center. And they were claiming for alternative regeneration of the area, because this was aimed to be a place for services, and then they were integrated into this. So my point here is that bottom-linked governance emerged, which is the idea of this initiative having support from the administration in different ways, but maintaining their autonomy because they have fears of cooptation. So in terms of agonistic participation, if you want, is like maintaining the possibility of conflict despite you are collaborating with administration, which is like, okay, we do an agreement, but then we have our voice and we can complain about things, and we can propose alternative things, and even eventually we can break the agreement if we want. So we are independent. So the idea here is that, well, the city council has money, but this money is a public money, so it's money from everybody. So we have the right to obtain this. So there was obviously a willingness from the city council to develop forms of public community partnerships, replacing to some extent the public-private partnerships. So they created new policy instruments. I could speak for hours about this because it's a matter of research. So they created the citizen heritage, or if you prefer, the citizens assets, which means that are some equipment and some services in the city are common, and then they can escape from the logic of public of the logic of doing a public build for who is managing the services in which the private sector can come in. So citizen heritage means that only community organizations can participate in this kind of management of services. So, and this was not created from the city council. This was created after a negotiation between the city council and community groups. And this is the powerfulness of this new policy instrument. Then we have the city in Barcelona, which is like, it's a software, or it's a platform which is used by the city council to do participatory processes, but at the same time is something that every single institution or citizens organization can use to facilitate participation inside their organization or participation outside the framework of what the city council is doing, which is very powerful tool indeed, and it's being exported somehow to other cities and to other institutions. So they did this, but at the same time they used old policy instruments from the 80s, which were forgotten somehow, or which could afford some flexibility to allow for this kind of bottom-link governance in which the citizens' initiatives could play a role without losing autonomy. Then what kind of urban regeneration initiatives emerge from this? Well, the idea that if we are planning to put public services and facilities, we take into consideration the existence of citizens' initiatives. And then, for instance, kindergartens, libraries, nursery homes, etc., are planned nearby these new public spaces and interaction of these public spaces. So urban gardens managed by the citizens are used by schools and by nursing homes like a place for leisure and for teaching the kids, etc. So this is an example of this kind of somehow soft regeneration policies in which citizens can have a role. Then I think this is like very interesting, this bottom line governance, but the issue, and this is part of the conclusion, is that not allows for autonomy from citizen initiatives and ensure their sustainability and impact capacity. The idea is that these initiatives at the end were based a lot on voluntary work by citizens, and they could not afford this anymore. So if you have technical support and you have financial support, it's easier. But these forms of governance take place only in some policy domains. So in culture, management of public space, etc. And they tend to be relegated in large urban regeneration projects. So they are consulted, or they are involved in participatory consulting processes, but it's much less about having political capacity to decide. We have, for instance, the example of the 2022 district here in Barcelona, in which there was this this reform of the old industrial area of the city, which took place in the last decade, and somehow they wanted to retook this project because it was not finished now after the crisis, but doing it much more inclusively. And the issue is that this was very difficult. There was a negotiation process involving citizens and private companies. Then they reached somehow an agreement, but then this go back to the traditional politics, and then and the city council voted for another project because well, there was negotiation between political parties, and then they voted for something else. So we have this limitation with this model, but at the end, it has opened the door for this kind of public community partnerships in management of social services, etc., which has an impact in urban regeneration. I prefer to stop here and to discuss with the others. I think it's very interesting to compare with the other cases. So if you agree, I stop here. Thank you. I have this small spam moment. If you want to know more, we have this book of Social Innovation and Urban Governance, Citizenship, Civil Society and Social Movements, which I did with my colleagues, and we explain all this and compare with other European cities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marc. So thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I think that just to make a small comment before we move to the questions in the audience, that it is true what Aris mentioned, that place actually matters and geography matters. And when we talk about participation, we have to understand the different local context, the governance, the culture, etc., and so on. But I think that that's what why we're here today. Particularly after the crisis of 2008, we have a participatory turn, let's say it, if we can coin such a phrase, with people and citizen movers demanding more access to decision-making processes, more transparency. This led to a shift in local governments in many cities across Europe, with mostly left coalitions that try to implement this kind of different policies. And I think that this pressure for more participation is what made other actors, like what Evie was describing in her presentation, to somehow co-opt this techniques to show to the public that they're not just huge foundations with no links to local agents or local stakeholders. So I think that this makes also the issue of the political dimension of participation more interesting to discuss the different role of actors, of social movements, of local governments, and how all this create the framework of participatory process in the whole. So I have some questions, but I will first let the people here. Yes, okay. So we have the microphone.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I want to ask first a question to Ms. Professor Athanasiou. Just to add on the concept of participation, we should also look on the participation that is outside the funds and the citizen action initiatives and different concepts that take form that outside the usual grants. There are some like art concepts or interaction with citizens that take actions in squares and other co-production and either art or agriculture. So don't need to forget that is happening in Athens as buildings or spaces take form and become cultural hubs that the city doesn't involve. So we need to keep in mind on that. And I want to just play the devil advocate here. All funds are bad, as a question to everyone also. We need to think that maybe through action we can change how the funds are approaching. And in the end, we can create, like, there's an interplay, what the strategy of the funds and how in the end the process is made. If you can understand, can explain more.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, of course, I agree that we should look also at these self-instituted community-led initiatives who obviously have very different techniques which are designed by them and not instigated by a global agent. And also they are, I guess, much more linked to reality. They are often also quite short-lived, and this is another discussion, but of course, I do not, I mean, my title, Global Participation as a Global Urban Strategy, was referring to the particular initiative, okay, of Rockefeller Foundation. But to your question whether all foundations are bad and all their funding activities are bad, again, no, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that what this initiative and other initiatives that have occurred in Greece the last decade represent are a shift to a different kind of governance. So it is important to see that although we talk a lot about how participation should be and needs to be, and I agree, of course, incorporated into institutional processes, we should also look at how many things happen in cities that are not part of this institutional process and come through other ways, which are not, first of all, which are not linked neither to societies and communities or to the institutional frameworks, but have a very strong impact on how cities work. So this is important to look at, because urban development is not directly just influenced by the planning framework or the development laws, but also by other agents which are often not given attention. That was so no, not all foundations are bad. But yeah, we should look at what happens and how participation is operationalized through them. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other question from the audience?
Thank you all for the great presentations. I wonder, and I'm genuinely curious, this is not a provocation, in cities and countries in the global south where you have a much more bigger reliance on donor aid and grant funding and private institutions, do we still have the same conversations about citizen-led autonomy and all of that, or do we have a conversation more about how do we reform private institutions and grant priorities and stuff? Where do we focus there when we're talking about the global south?
I think Agnès wants to answer.
Yeah, it's addressed to everyone.
Yeah, but I come from Cairo. I mean, I'm living now in Cairo, so I can speak a little bit about that topic because it depends also of the type of political regime. We mostly speak in Europe of democracy. I mean, we're democratic, more or less authoritarian, but still democracies. So what we call the global south is made of very extremely poor countries and emerging countries, which is a very big difference. There is a huge diversity that Europe doesn't know, and from a political standpoint as well, because you cannot compare situations where, like some Latin American countries where participation is a very long tradition in cooperative housing, for example, Uruguay, or in precarious neighborhoods or informal housing, like in Peru, for example, and where there is a strong coordination, I mean, with some local authorities, and countries where there is no democracy and authoritarianism is very strong, or even big repression. So what always strikes me is that in a certain way also repressive regime, and that makes us allow some part of participatory planning. When it doesn't come to affect, but this is also true in France, for example, when it doesn't come to affect their direct economic interests. So if you have participatory planning, for example, in Egypt on community gardens, why not? Even the government can allow that, can tolerate that. But if it comes to work along with people against evictions, massive evictions, for instance, in a lot of countries, and it won't be possible anymore, and it will be reduced to activist thing and be prohibited. So, and there is, for example, Egypt is a very interesting case because 10 years ago, before the revolution, you started to have, since in around 2008, exactly at the same time that emerging, citizen activists and professional networks in Europe, you started to have a lot of community groups working with architects and people from university and stuff. And okay, and now, they are all more or less, they can, barely work with some municipalities, but it's very difficult. And but I think the major difference is that we speak about mostly countries that are ruled by a lot of informality. Informal sector is very strong, and informal sector in housing or in economy is already about pooling yourself community resources to survive or to make a better life. So participation is what Asef Bayat called participation par le bas. I mean, bottom up, is very strong. Our ordinary politics is also made of that. And this is precisely what we don't see anymore when we come to very, organized countries, Western countries, where, participation is everything, but not informal, and informality is completely hidden, whereas it's a very important component of society, in fact. So I think there is much more experience in the South country of how you can be involved with communities, because it's also an ordinary practice, very common, and it doesn't have to be put into rules and stuff to be done. It's done already. There is solidarity practices at each level, and so it's also a matter. I mean, I think it is very, very interesting. We have this conversation at Appui, for example. We started to have this conversation. We noticed that all the staff And most of the practitioners and all the academics have been living elsewhere in the south before starting to be involved in with communities in France, mostly in Brazil. I mean, all the staff has been living in Brazil to start with and working in favelas. And by chance, you know, I mean, they are all here. I mean, and they know how to act with communities, which is something that we often forget in Western Europe, I think, to be naturally, you know, emerge within communities, not just doing some workshops here and there, and you know, doing active community work.
Any other question?
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, I have two questions. One for Evie. I was wondering, in the participation divide tools that these foundations are, I mean, setting. Do we know who is the community that they are trying to involve? I mean, what social groups? Because it's a bit well, who is the community? And one other for Agnès. In France, we have a strong tradition of state financing for associations, and that is not the case, for instance, in the United States, where a lot of community organizing groups are funded by foundations. So, is it a possibility, for instance, in France or maybe in other countries to take from the foundation to finance that community-led groups?
Okay, just to be as short as you can. Okay.
For example, of Thessaloniki and the project that I showed pictures of, the community were people from the neighborhood and the local groups. But I have to say that the actual park that was chosen for the pilot project to be implemented was from a very, I don't know, middle-class area that no important conflicts were ever reported. So, you know, the school community was participated, and so I think that this was not done by chance. I mean, okay, the local community was involved, and of course, I must say that there was not involved in big numbers. Okay, and the whole event culminated in like a feast in the park, you know, with a lot of post-it with nice words and I want more green. We know this kind of tools. And I don't believe it had any continuation afterwards. So the local community was involved, but there was no binding outcome, and there was nothing after that, as far as we know and we've seen. Yeah, that's it for me.
Yes, I think it's a very strong thing that is very positive in ways that the state is able to finance NGOs, civil society associations, but it has also a backlog. I don't know. I mean, there is also some problems coming up with this. I mean, the ones that we know the most are the most recent researchers about demobilization, the popular neighborhoods made by Julien Talpin and so on, showing that there is a very strong tendency of state agency to suppress the fundings when these civil society associations are too clement, too much contesting the policies. So there is also some, you know, it's difficult to maintain contest claims when you are financed by the state. It's a very big contradiction, and that we have sometimes at Appui as well. When we are writing our final annual reports, it's always a question: how do you put things? You know, you are contesting part of what the National Renewal Agency is doing, which is a very large, you know, power. We speak about billions of euros every year, and You know, it's so I think, I mean, I don't think that foundations are an alternative, but it can be sometimes, and in addition, it can allow more flexibility, more independence, and also maybe make some showcase, very important showcase, to reveal the capacity and competencies of the dwellers and the residents. Like, let's dream, for example, community-led housing in resettlements, in urban renewal projects, like in some, like we have been seeing in Chicago, or in some in the ghetto, in some ghettos in North America, where people, of course, they have no other resources than themselves, which is a big difference with Europe or with France. But we also now are at the point where we have to demonstrate that ordinary people, migrants, etc., are also capable not only to deteriorate and to make riots, but also to build some things. And, you know, maybe foundations could help reveal this capacity.
Okay, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but we can have one question. Okay, I don't know, Lucas, you want to? Okay, I suggest that maybe just to finish with the questions, Lucas, who else will have a question? Yorgos? Yes. Okay. Yes. And don't forget that we also have Aris and Marc, so if you want to address anything, they are also here. So.
Okay, thank you very much for all the presentations. They were really exciting and very informative. I would like to ask something about the dimension of time in building institutions and having institutional change, because we saw on the one hand the experiences of France and also of Berlin and Barcelona, and it seems that there is a path of institutional change that goes on for many years and creates some kind of different steps and somehow touches with the space and geography and the local specificities. And then we saw in the presentation of Evie a different form of participation that comes top down and from the global perspective, let's say, trying to transfer lessons learned and good practices and somehow implement it on a place. And I think that the third world countries or the countries of this global south are particularly relevant in this type of participation. And I wanted to somehow ask on this notion of time in building institutional change and binding it better to the local needs and the local societies.
Thank you. So I would like first to address a question to Evie. Okay, I try to be really quick. So what are the links between the different big foundations that you quoted and maybe other ones coming from Germany, from Greece, from the American ones? I mean, are they cooperating together or struggling or sharing the cake like the market? Since they seem to have the same generous, as you said, agenda, what are their links? And for Ares about Berlin, and maybe Agnès as well, you presented some successful victories in the context of the agonistic ways in urban planning context, but have you got at the end satisfying examples as well for institutional participation, or is it better to definitely forget about this because it's always like a fake process, and better to opt for the agonistic ways to put some pressure on the decision makers and lead to new balances, as you suggested, Agnès?
Very quickly, maybe continuing with what Sylvain just said, mainly addressed to Aris, but maybe you can all comment. My question is a more theoretical one, that if we follow this methodology or scheme that Aris proposed, that in the word participation we put also the institutional practices, but also the social movement practices, don't we have does it have the danger of becoming what we call in Greece an empty shirt, that the notion that doesn't say anything by putting too much info into that? Is it okay to use participation everywhere, or maybe we should focus that this is a social movement practice and we should not call it participation? I am just saying, I'm wondering.
Okay, so because we have also a question from Zoom, Margarita Angelidou asks if the speakers could comment their views about how administration can actually cultivate a culture of participation and spark the interest of the citizens to participate in collaborative planning. So I suggest, in order, because we need to close shortly, maybe we have Aris, Marc, Agnès, and then Evie to comment, to do a last comment about 2 minutes, taking also into consideration the questions. So Aris, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will start. I will start with Lucas' question about time. I think it's so obvious that it's very difficult to say anything about it, right? Everything that we see develops over time. Institutions change over time. You need to add time to things, and sometimes administration and let's say large foundations or corporations work at completely different timescales. So while we're waiting and we're discussing, somebody just comes and just does something while we're still discussing it. I personally don't see a solution to that. I just need to state it. What I would like to think a bit more is the role of administration. I think that, first of all, let's not forget that both administration and institutions, as I was saying earlier, institutional frameworks are products of politics, right? They are not neutral. They are there, they have been created over time and so on. So you may have, in theory, participation even inscribed in administration and so on, but it's in reality never implemented. So it's not enough to have it. You need some kind of a movement that is able to control it and make sure that that participation actually takes place, because it's not enough to have a law that says it. From the administration, I think there are many things that administration could do, but I'll say just one because of time. I think it's transparency, just making sure that information is there, that information is accessible. Accessible doesn't mean it's somewhere on the internet, right? It's there and you have the possibility to understand it. It's an understandable language. There are people there who can explain it to citizens and so on. And for me, that's number one role of administration in that. I would never say that institutional participation is not important. On the contrary, I think that what we see is that the clear distinction between institutional participation and agonistic participation is not there. I don't think there is purely top-down or bottom-up. There is always a kind of combination of things. Institutional change very often comes from citizen pressure, and then what happens then from the administration has an effect on how civil societies function. And finally, on the definition of different types of participation, first of all, is not mine, right? So these 5 types of participation are clearly defined also in the Berlin framework that says what is participation. And these are kind of a standard use also in different theories around democracy and what it means. You can say, in a sense, that what we're talking about are 5 different forms of democracy. And I understand, in my understanding of participation, we had that discussion yesterday already, participation is a citizenship right. So it's part of a democratic process. It's not just a technocratic process. And that's why I insist on including this type of deliberative participation into more agonistic, movement-led, whatever you want to call it, types of participation, and all 5 that I mentioned.
Okay, Thank you very much. Marc, any comments?
Yes, very fast. I think about time. I think it's to add something, not to solve the question, but I think it's important to take into consideration the institutional trajectories and past dependency. It's not only about time, but about what you had in the past. And this is clearly the case of Barcelona, but if you compare with Madrid, for instance, in which they had the same strong movement as Barcelona had, they were less successful in implementing change because it was easier here, because change could connect to something from the past. So I think this is an element for thought. So how to promote a culture of participation? I think that it's not easy, but one element is to make it relevant, that citizens can perceive that there is an impact, not only in the specific decision or the project, but that they are, as Alice was saying, that they are exercising their political rights. And this is the issue, that they have this feeling and not being consulted about some static aspects or some key aspects, but that generate this feeling of exercising rights. And this is especially important for those who have not other citizenship rights, in the sense that they are foreigners, for instance, but they can be involved in this kind of processes. And so I don't distinguish between institutional participation and what social movements do. I think social movements participate in a different way, in a more conflictive way, but then we can find forms in which these two ways of participating merge or conflict sometimes. But these are two forms of participation. So I think these are my 3 comments. So I stop here.
Thank you, Marc, very much. So, Agnès?
Sorry, I had time to check for translation. So what is often stated, it was the case already in Morocco, for example, in the works done by our colleague Françoise Naves-Bouchanin 15 years ago in slum resettlements projects, for example. But it's also the case sometimes you hear that in France people speak about a travesty of participation, a simulacrum, I don't know the term in English. So it's like a smoke curtain. And this is a very strong, dominant now impression about participation. Not when it comes to like rehabilitating the square of the Republic, which is not when it comes to public space, but where there is real, I think we need to differentiate, where there is real political and economic challenges at stake. There, participation starts to be very tough, because in fact, everything is often very, I mean, what ordinary people say is true. Very often, most of the times, decisions are already taken. This is very important to consider. So it leads to this famous depoliticization, retreat from the politics. And at the end, what you see, especially in popular neighborhoods, people don't vote anymore. So it's a real crisis of democracy. I mean, and this is why more the crisis is heavy and more political leaders want to re-emphasize on participation, but they still don't give up their powers. I mean, they still, continue to lock down every kind of decision that is important related, and this is really, our question is really how to unlock where the real and important decisions are taken. And it's not easy. It's a continual fight, in fact. So it takes a long time. This is why you need time. You need time to have this, to work with lanceurs d'alerte. I don't know, how do you call it in English? People who call for alert, especially in the environmental field, which is very important when, especially when you are in a country with more than 30 nuclear plants. and etc., etc. You need to work with journalists to have underground information, because sometimes you just can't get access to open information when it comes to important matters. And I don't think, I will be very surprised that it is very different in other countries, because still, you know, local powers, and this is a question about how local authorities and state feel and resent their role in democracy. As elected power, they feel that they are legitimate to take decisions. And what are these troublemakers that wants to intervene into this? And it's still a battle. So, frankly, you know, there is different conceptions of participation, and we are still struggling to find a way to. And of course, time is very important. And I mean that when you work with communities, the other aspect is that time, you cannot just spot consultation teams to come once a month and to make consultation. It doesn't work. People don't trust. It takes ages to get trust in deprived areas, in segregated areas especially. It takes ages. It's very different in rich and wealthy neighborhoods and etc. And you need to have people that already know the communities and that are intermediaries and can, you know, and this is a real, it makes a difference, in fact. You cannot work in many neighborhoods anymore if you don't know people since a long time. And this is why all the participation professionals kind of are, you know, can't work. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Evie. Just
I would be very good. Well, just to for the question about the links between foundations, well, I haven't gone that far to locate those links, but I can say that they do share. They do have a lot in common in terms of the discourses they employ and of the policies they support. They have an emphasis on data, on global networking, on green development, this kind of discourses. So this links them together. I don't know if there are other, you know, real links. I mean, they're not connected as far as I have seen in those I've studied. Okay, in terms of time, I will not say anything. Well, I can only say that I think it's a function. I mean, the time it takes to really incorporate it and to make it work, I guess it is a function of the trust and the continuity that is built. I mean, if you really do this in a transparent way that shows some impact and people see some outcomes, I guess this will have an effect in trust, in people to trust other processes like that. And I think this is also the answer to Ms. Angelidou's question. So if you build trust, then I think people will actually trust the process and participate.
No, thank you. Sorry, sorry, because we're a bit late. So thank you a lot. I'm sure, Agnès, if you want to add, we can talk later. So, and now we're moving to the next session after a short break. Thank you very much. And thank you also, Marc and Ari, for joining us through Zoom. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.